I've sat at the edge of more than 2,000 beds as life quietly slipped out of the room. For 38 years, that was my work. Listening. And after hearing 2,000 different lives recounted in their final hours, I can tell you a secret that took me 87 years to fully understand. I wasn't hearing 2,000 different stories. I was hearing one story, told in 2,000 voices, with 2,000 different names. It's the story of a life spent fighting battles that can't be won, for prizes that aren't real. I see it now, through my window, in the young couple next door. Their faces are tight with anger over something that will be dust in a week, and in them, I see my own younger self. I see the ghosts of my patients. They are exhausted from carrying things they were never meant to carry, and I feel a pressing need, a quiet urgency, to tell you what I learned from all their goodbyes. There is a freedom on the other side of all that noise, and it's a tragedy to only find it at the very end. My days are quiet now. The house is the same one where I raised my children, where my husband and I argued over things as trivial as the couple next door. The fabric on my armchair is worn smooth from decades of use, and the teacup in my hand has a small chip on the rim that I've known for 20 years. These small, constant things have become my anchors. On the side table, my husband's reading glasses sit exactly where he left them. They remind me that our love was real, far more real than the foolish arguments we wasted our precious time on. I wasn't always this peaceful. For most of my life, I ran on the same flawed software as everyone else. The belief that my value was tied to being right, to being approved of, to staying busy. I carried the weight of other people's expectations like stones in my pockets. The peace I feel now wasn't given to me, it was earned. It was paid for with a lifetime of my own regrets, and the final, whispered regrets of thousands of others. And that is why I'm talking to you. Because you don't have to wait. You don't need to reach the end to learn how to live. My mornings begin with a ritual of silence. The kettle's whistle is the loudest sound in the house, a brief interruption to the calm. I pour the water into the same chipped teacup I've used since my husband Robert was alive. He bought it for me at a flea market, and I remember complaining that it was secondhand. How foolish that seems now. I sit in my armchair, the fabric worn thin as an old memory, and watch the dust motes dance in the morning light. They seem so free, so unburdened. On the table next to me, Robert's reading glasses remain. I don't keep them there for sadness. I keep them as a reminder that our life together was built on thousands of these quiet moments. But we were often too busy arguing about who was right to notice them. This house used to be filled with the noise of a life lived on autopilot. Now its silence speaks a profound truth about all the time we waste. I wasn't born this way, with this quiet in my heart. For 60 years, I was just like that couple next door. I was a soldier in a war nobody wins, fighting for the approval of people whose names I can no longer remember. I remember standing in front of the mirror in my 40s, hating the woman I saw because a dress didn't fit the way it was supposed to. I remember the bitter, acidic taste of resentment I held for my own sister over a forgotten comment at a family dinner. My energy was a currency I spent on being offended, on proving my point, on worrying about the future and regretting the past. I was so busy being a good employee, a perfect mother, a flawless wife, that I forgot to simply be present. The greatest tragedy is that I thought this was normal. I believed that this constant, grinding anxiety was the price of a responsible life. It wasn't. It was the price of a life lived for everything but myself. The change didn't come like a lightning strike. It came quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, brought back by the memory of a woman named Margaret. She was 76, with bones as fragile as a bird's wing, and a fire in her eyes that could have burned down the whole hospital. I remember walking into her room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and regret. On her bedside table was a stack of cheap stationery and a pen that her shaking hand could barely hold. She wasn't focused on her pain or her fear of what was coming. She was consumed by a single burning mission: to write letters. Letters to her estranged son, to a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 30 years, to a neighbor from a house she'd sold decades ago. She was trying to correct the record, to have the final word in arguments that everyone else had long forgotten. I saw in her a lifetime of energy poured into the need to be right, a need so powerful it was eclipsing her own death. Every day, I would watch her struggle. Her fingers, gnarled with arthritis, would try to form the words on the page. "He needs to know," she would whisper, her voice a dry rasp. "He needs to know he was wrong about the fence in '87. She was trying to rewrite history, to win battles that had ended long ago, fought on fields that had since turned to dust. The stack of unfinished letters grew, each one a testament to a life spent holding on to grievances as if they were precious heirlooms. It was heartbreaking. She was spending her last, most precious currency, her final moments of consciousness, on the emotional equivalent of balancing a checkbook from a bank that had closed 40 years ago. There was no peace in that room. Only the frantic, exhausting energy of a war that could never be won because the enemy was an illusion, a ghost of her own making. The fence was gone. The cousin was gone. The only thing left was the weight of being right. One afternoon, as I was adjusting her pillow, she looked at me with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "It doesn't matter, does it?" she asked, the pen falling from her hand. The fire in her eyes finally dimmed, replaced by a profound, bottomless exhaustion. It was the look of a soldier who finally realizes the war she dedicated her life to was a complete and utter waste. In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't just her story I was witnessing. It was my own. It was Robert's. It was the story of the couple next door. It was the story of 2,000 souls I had sat with. We were all Margaret, spending our lives fighting over fences, collecting proof, writing letters that no one would ever read, all in a desperate attempt to be vindicated. The profound sadness of it settled in my bones, a cold, heavy truth. We were dying from a sickness of the soul, a focus on the utterly insignificant. Margaret passed away 2 days later, the stack of letters sitting untouched on her nightstand. I stood in the quiet of her empty room, looking at those pages filled with trembling, unfinished sentences. The arguments were finally over. The need to be right had dissolved into the sterile silence of the hospital. And in that silence, my purpose became clear. My peace was no longer a private comfort to be enjoyed in my armchair. It was a map, a guide out of a wilderness that so many people were still lost in. I had spent 38 years listening to the final chapters. Now I had to tell the beginning. I had to tell people that they didn't have to reach the end to understand. They could put down the pen. They could walk away from the fence. The quiet understanding I had cultivated for myself was no longer enough. It had become a responsibility. It became the reason I am speaking to you now. After Margaret, I started to see the ghosts of my own past battles everywhere, especially in the quiet corners of this house. For years, my husband Robert and I were generals in a silent household war over the virtue of being right. It was never about anything important. It was about which way the toilet paper should hang, or the correct route to a destination we'd driven to 100 times. I remember the feeling, a hot tightness in my chest, the absolute certainty that my way was the only way. I would marshal my evidence, present my case, and fight until he conceded. And what did I win? A moment of hollow triumph, followed by an evening of thick, resentful silence. We would sit in the same room, two strangers separated by a wall of my own making. I look at his reading glasses now, sitting on the side table, and I would give anything to have back one of those stupid, wasted evenings. I'd let him be right about everything, just to feel his hand in mine, to share the simple, unburdened quiet. The prize for being right is loneliness. That's a truth that took me far too long to learn. The war wasn't just with others. The most exhausting one was the one I fought against myself. For most of my life, I lived with a judge in my head, a relentless critic who chronicled my every failure. I remember being 45, getting ready for a wedding, and standing in front of the mirror in a new dress. I didn't see a woman, a wife, a mother. I saw a collection of flaws. I saw a body that had betrayed the image I thought the world demanded. The anxiety was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. I spent the entire evening pulling at the fabric, sucking in my breath, convinced every person in the room was silently judging the way the material clung to my hips. I was so consumed by this imaginary tribunal that I barely remember the couple getting married. I sacrificed a night of joy at the altar of other people's imagined opinions. It was a self-imposed prison, and I was both the inmate and the guard. The truth is, nobody was thinking about me. They were all too busy worrying about what I was thinking about them. We were all trapped in the same lonely cell. And then there were the grudges. I carried them like stones, polishing them with my thoughts until they shone with the righteousness of my own pain. For nearly a decade, I held a bitter resentment against my own sister for a comment she made at a Thanksgiving dinner. I don't even remember the exact words anymore, but I remember how I nurtured that wound. I replayed the scene in my mind thousands of times, each time adding another layer of insult, another proof of her malice. It became a part of my identity, the wronged sister. It cost me 10 years of real connection with the only person on earth who shared my childhood. We saw each other at holidays, exchanging polite, hollow pleasantries, the unspoken anger hanging between us like a thick curtain. I was so busy protecting my right to be hurt that I never stopped to consider what I was losing. One day she called me, her voice small, to tell me she had been diagnosed with something serious. In that instant, the grudge turned to ash. It was gone, and all that was left was the horrifying, empty space of a decade we could never get back. That decade of silence with my sister was a heavy price, but the true turning point, the moment the entire landscape of my life shifted, didn't happen in a single dramatic confrontation. It was quieter. It was a slow, crushing accumulation. It happened somewhere between the 1000th and 2000th goodbye. For years, I believed I was a collector of unique stories, each life a distinct thread in a vast, complicated tapestry. I listened to farmers talk about the land, to soldiers about battles, to mothers about their children. But one night, sitting in the sterile quiet of a hospital hallway at 3 a.m., the fluorescent lights humming a lonely tune, a different truth began to surface. The faces changed, the names were forgotten, but the final words, the essence of the final regrets, were starting to sound eerily the same. I was collecting echoes, not stories. It was a terrifying and profound realization, the feeling that I was standing on the shore of an immense ocean, witnessing the same wave crash, over and over again. The pattern wasn't in what they had done, but in what they had carried. It was always about the weight of being right about a property line, the weight of an apology never given to a son, the weight of a lifetime spent worrying about the opinions of neighbors who had long since moved away, the weight of hating their own bodies, their own reflections in the mirror, for 50 years. The stories were different on the surface, but the architecture of the pain was identical. They were all soldiers who had fought with ferocious loyalty in the wrong war. They had defended tiny, insignificant hills of pride, while the vast, beautiful continents of their lives went unexplored. I saw it so clearly. We are all born with our hands open, ready to receive the world, but we spend our lives slowly clenching them into fists, holding on so tightly to our grievances and our righteousness that we can no longer receive the simple gifts of a quiet moment, a shared laugh, or the forgiveness of a loved one. The final shattering moment of clarity came on a rainy Tuesday in my car, parked in the hospital lot. I had just left the room of a man who spent his last coherent hour meticulously detailing how his brother had wronged him in a business deal 40 years prior. He was trying to recruit me as the final witness for his prosecution. As I watched the rain wash over the windshield, blurring the world outside, the weight of 2,000 similar confessions collapsed on me. It was a physical sensation, a pressure in my chest, and I knew I wasn't hearing 2,000 different stories. I was hearing one story, told in 2,000 voices. It was the story of a life given to the tyranny of the trivial, a life spent fighting unwinnable battles for prizes that were never real to begin with. We were all dying from the same illness, a spiritual sickness born from a focus on the utterly, heartbreakingly insignificant. In that moment, my work was no longer about easing death. It was about understanding life. That revelation changed me. It wasn't just about my patients anymore. It was about me. Every foolish argument I'd had with Robert, every moment I'd wasted on self-criticism, every grudge I had polished like a precious stone, it all clicked into place. These weren't my unique personal failings. They were my symptoms of the universal human condition, the one I had been documenting for 38 years without ever truly seeing it in myself. The sadness of this was immense, but underneath it was a strange and powerful liberation. The burden of my own past mistakes felt lighter because I understood their source. It was no longer my shame, it was our shared tragedy. And with that understanding came a new, quiet, and unshakable purpose. My life was no longer about just living peacefully in this house with my memories. It was about taking this map, this truth that had cost 2,000 lives to chart, and offering it to anyone still lost in that same wilderness, fighting that same pointless war. The first real change wasn't an action, but a release. It was the quiet, internal act of forgiving the woman I used to be. For years, the memories of my own foolishness, the arguments with Robert, the vanity in front of the mirror, the cold silence with my sister, had been sources of a quiet, persistent shame. But after seeing the same patterns in 2,000 other lives, the shame began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and gentle compassion. I wasn't uniquely flawed. I was universally human. I was simply running the same flawed software as everyone else, playing a role I had been taught without question. Forgiving myself wasn't about excusing the wasted time or the pain caused. It was about accepting that I had been doing the best I could with the tools I had. It was acknowledging that you cannot blame a person for being lost in a forest when they were never given a map. That understanding was the key. It didn't erase the past, but it took away its power to wound me in the present. With that forgiveness came a new way of being in this house, in this life. The quiet is no longer empty. It's full. The silence is not an absence of noise, but the presence of peace. My morning cup of tea is no longer a routine. It's a ritual of gratitude. I hold the chipped cup and feel the warmth spread through my hands, and for those few minutes, that is my entire world. I consciously choose to let go every single day. When a memory of an old argument surfaces, I don't push it away. I look at it, acknowledge the ghost of the old me who needed so desperately to be right, and I let it pass by like a cloud in the sky. It is an active practice, this unclenching of the soul. It is the daily decision to put down the stones I carried for so long. This peace I inhabit isn't a permanent state I achieved. It's a garden I must tend to every morning, pulling the weeds of old habits and watering the seeds of presence and acceptance. And in that garden, a new purpose began to grow. The peace I had found was no longer a private comfort, a personal reward for a long life. It became a responsibility. The stories of those 2,000 souls, the weight of their final regrets, coalesced inside me, not as a burden, but as a clear and urgent directive. My life's work hadn't ended when I left the hospice. It had simply entered a new phase. I had been a collector of final chapters, a witness to the consequences of a life lived asleep. Now my role was to be a lighthouse, to offer a warning and a light to the ships still sailing toward those same rocks. This story, this truth that took a lifetime to uncover, is not mine to keep. It is a map charted with the last breaths of thousands, and it is my final duty and my greatest honor to pass it on. It is the reason I am speaking to you now, because the greatest tragedy of all is a lesson learned too late to be used. So this is the great secret, the final quiet truth whispered at the end of 2,000 lives. A good life is not a fortress you build to protect your pride, but a garden you tend with an open hand. It isn't about acquiring more approval, more victories, more proof that you are right, but about having the profound courage to release what is heavy and serves no purpose. I look at my husband's reading glasses, sitting right where he left them, and I understand now that our love wasn't forged in the battles we won against each other, but in the quiet, shared moments we almost missed. The prize for being right is a lonely room filled with echoes. The reward for letting go is peace. I see the young couple next door, and I no longer see foolishness. I see their exhaustion. They are carrying the same stones I carried for 60 years, and my heart aches with the desire to tell them that the ground is right there, waiting for them to finally set it all down. Please do not wait for the final act to finally understand the play. You do not need a terminal diagnosis to get your priorities straight. This wisdom, gathered at the edge of thousands of graves, is not a secret meant for the dying. It is a map for the living. Your life, this very day, is the only permission you need to begin. The freedom I feel now, in this quiet house with my teacup and my memories, is not a special prize reserved for the old and the tired. It is a choice, available to you in this very moment and every moment that follows. You can put down the weight of that old grudge. You can forgive the person in the mirror. You can walk away from the argument that wins you nothing but a hollow silence. The question isn't whether you will run out of time. We all do. The only question is, what will you choose to do with the precious, unrepeatable time you have left?